evening. You're on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer, fighting for people's liberty to use tobacco, which has been used for 8,000 years in the New World. And in North America, I think it's around 3,000 years. Recently, on Audrey Silk's website, new information, new historical information has come out so that we can say with a great deal of assurance that long before Europeans came to these shores, Native Americans were smoking and using tobacco recreationally, trading tobacco. So this was not something that was pushed by the evil big tobacco companies, but something that was very much part of the New World, used not just for ceremonial reasons, but used throughout the day. Columbus's sailors saw how much the Indians were smoking and picked up the habit themselves, and of course brought it back to Europe about 450 years ago. So it's been time tested, and now we have a international cartel of health fascists or Nazis who will do everything they can to interfere with the daily lives of people who smoke, and will do everything they can to hamper the businesses which depend on smokers and people who enjoy tobacco. Now, of course, if things keep going as they're going, the trend is fewer and fewer people smoking, and more restrictions, higher and higher taxes, and ever increasing coercive measures. One of the most coercive, I think, is the idea of forcing tobacco companies to put very, very repellent images on their product. What is called plain packaging, but it's really not plain packaging. It's a theft of intellectual property. It is the government compelling citizens, private enterprise, to go along with the government's perceived notions of what is good for people. And this is the antithesis of freedom and the antithesis of free enterprise. So one thing that is really kind of a bogus myth, one of the many myths spread by people in the tobacco control cartel, is that somehow tobacco companies had certain information and certain studies and whatnot that they did not reveal to the public. But this has been, the lie has been put on this by even people who are anti-smokers, that tobacco is one of the most studied plants over the last 100 years. And the perception that it is a vice and something that it should be, by many people, the perception that it should be eradicated and people should be forced to stop smoking, goes way, way back before there was even any modern tobacco companies or even any modern smoking cartel, anti-smoking cartel. For example, I was looking at an advertisement that was advertising denicotinized tobacco. I think it was, the advertisement was 1852. And if you read Mark Twain, probably whom many people consider to be the greatest American author who's ever lived, he rails against anti-tobacconists, and that's, I'm talking about in the 1890s, 1880s, and evidently a lot of people had the perception, particularly European Americans, that tobacco was a vice, an evil that would be greatly would greatly benefit mankind if it were eradicated rather than benefit mankind by its existence. And Mark Twain railed against that, and even in my own memory, one of the things I remember as a child of about 5 or 6 years old is hearing someone say to my mother that a friend of his or a friend of hers had quit smoking and felt 20 years younger. Of course, I don't believe that now, but at the time I believed it. But my point in bringing it, and I determined never to smoke, although within a few years I was enjoying the weed, the tobacco weed, very much. But the point is that the perception that tobacco was very bad in many people's minds, if not most people, goes back at least 100 years. So this idea that somehow the tobacco companies, the great evil tobacco companies, were somehow keeping a secret from the American public and the American government is nonsense. And it just goes to show that really the people in tobacco control have very few scruples in their war on smokers, and again on those businesses that depend on them, and on anything that will be enjoyable for people who smoke. So therefore we keep seeing more and more restrictions that you can't enjoy tobacco even on a college campus, you can't enjoy it in a public park, you cannot enjoy it in your own home. And of course, what people fail to realize is, regarding what you can think about tobacco and smoking, this is a society that's becoming ever more restrictive, particularly in petty ways. And as Alexis de Tocqueville rightly pointed out, one of the very interesting and scholarly commentators on America, Frenchman, was that losing one's liberty in small ways often is more important than losing one's freedom in larger ways, because in small ways it affects more people more often. So many times in our daily lives, like a lot of people rail against what they consider to be the excesses of Donald Trump, but most people don't feel this at all in their everyday lives. Yet, for example, I cannot enjoy a cigarette at this table in front of you because of Massachusetts state law, not because CCTV decided to ban smoking or because the public did, but because the powerful people did. And with this anti-smoking movement, whether one is a smoker or not a smoker, the expanse of the government is ever increasing. Laws are made, and again, on an activity that affects one every day of one's life, and in so many ways. Again, for example, our freedom of speech, although it's a very valuable thing, and we have it, thank God, in this country, most people really don't exercise their First Amendment right very much. But having a beer and a cigarette, or a cup of coffee and a cigarette in a comfortable place, out of the rain and out of the snow, is something that goes a long way to making life pleasant or less difficult than it often is. In that regard, I saw an article in the New York Times, which has been a very anti-smoking newspaper going way back, I think, into the 1880s. I think there was an editorial in the New York Times in the 1880s saying that the decadence of Spain, or the decline in Spain, came about because of the cigarette, which of course I don't know what decline they were talking about, but so the Times, for some reason, going back over 100 years, has always been very prone to print and print articles, etc., about how bad tobacco is, and also in their editorial pages editorialize against tobacco and the tobacco industry. And I was looking at the Tuesday edition of the Times, which has the Science Times, which often has very interesting articles. Sometimes these articles, I think, undermine the kind of authority that people who are in the science profession of science want to mantle themselves with. A recent article in the New York Times documented how a so-called landmark study put out about, I would say probably about 5 years ago, that was supposed to document the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, was recently retracted by the New England Journal of Medicine. And many researchers, expert researchers said that this study was very sloppily done, which doesn't mean that the Mediterranean diet isn't healthy or is healthy. What it means is the study itself that was supposed to prove that it was healthy was very sloppily done. And what most interests me about this is not whether this study was sloppy or not sloppy, or whether the Mediterranean diet is good for you or bad for you, but that this study was peer-reviewed and published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. And I mean, this is happening very often. So when people talk about a study being peer-reviewed, it means very, very little. I don't think, according to many experts, this study was just a mess. So that nobody who looked at that study or reviewed that study did it with any kind of care. And then again, it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is supposed to be very careful and very rigorous in terms of their studies, but it doesn't seem like they are. And that's just another of the many examples where this happens, yet people like to point to these journals and say, oh, here is a study that shows tobacco, smoking, etc. is so bad for you and whatnot. But if you examine this, you don't even have to be an expert to examine some of these studies and see that they're very, very weak. Well, there was an article in the New York Times Science section yesterday about Chinese men who smoke and who live in New York, and how the city health department now is going to really badger them to quit smoking, because their rate of smoking is much higher than other populations in New York City. And I don't know what the rates are of this. According to this article, in New York City, Asian men, I think we're talking about men, or we might be talking about the population as a whole, but Asian men have a 23% smoking rate, white 18%, Hispanic 17%, and black 14%. Well, I was very happy to see that the smoking rate among the white population, I assume it's the white population, might be white male, I don't know, in New York is 18%, which is higher than the national average, which is really interesting considering that New York has some of the most draconian anti-smoking rules in effect. No smoking in public parks, no smoking on beaches, no smoking in bars, no smoking in restaurants. And now the New York City Health Department is pressuring all landlords, along with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to ban smoking in people's own houses. But somehow, according to this article, in the last 15 years, the rate of lung cancer among Chinese men has increased 70%, which of course sounds like a large number, but it's probably not a large number, because all it tells you is that, for example, if 1 out of 1,000 Chinese men died of lung cancer, and now we have 2 out of 1,000, that would be an increase of 100%, which is more than 70%. And if you reverse that, that means 900, prior to this, 999 out of 1,000 men smokers didn't get lung cancer, and now 998 didn't get it. So it could be a very small number, because a lot of times when they use these statistics as scare tactics, they don't give the absolute number, so that you never know if there is a large number, or if the increase is great. I mean, recently we've heard a little buzz about suicides in the United States, particularly after I can never remember the name of the woman, but Anthony Bourdain committed suicide, and people are talking about an increase in suicide, but it might be an increase, it might be even a big percentage increase, but really the number itself probably hasn't moved much in the last 15 or 20 years. There has been some increase, but of course, if you read about, people are thinking there's an epidemic of suicides, and it's increasing. But I think that story is going to die down pretty quickly. But one thing I did notice that when they talk about Chinese men in New York having an increase in lung cancer, in another article, I think it says that compared with other Asians, Chinese women also have a high incidence and death rate from lung cancer, but their smoking rates are very low. So if Chinese women are dying at a higher rate from lung cancer than other Asians and other than New Yorkers, maybe the reason that Chinese men maybe has nothing to do with their smoking. So there are many things in this report that indicate it's more or less scare tactics, and most of the statistics are very dubious. But I think at this moment I am going to go to our Smoker of the Week. Always interesting to see if I can pull this person up with any kind of real skill. And here we go. Aha, here we are. Let's see if we can get this a little bit bigger. This is Deng Xiaoping, who is, oh, get rid of that guy. Oh my gosh. Anyway, Deng Xiaoping, who took over from Mao Zedong when Mao died, I think, which was about 1978. And Deng Xiaoping was the ruler of communist China from 1978 until 1989, and considered a very, very powerful man, moved China kind of forward into a more consumeristic society, spread a lot of wealth, eliminated a lot of power, a lot of poverty. Here is this photo taken, I think, around 1984 with the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and Deng Xiaoping is smoking his favorite cigarettes, which were Panda cigarettes, which I think were the finest cigarettes produced in China, which incidentally is the largest grower of tobacco in the world. I think 42% of the world's tobacco comes from China. And in China, and that's Helmut Kohl, and that's Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, I don't know when he died exactly, but he did die at the age of 92. So even though he was a chain smoker, probably from his teen years, he probably had, I would assume, at least a 75-year smoking career. and died at the age of 92 and been a very powerful man in China. So certainly, or perhaps his intellect was helped by tobacco, not hindered. And so that's our smoker of the week. And let me just see if I can get him off there. And Mao Zedong, also, who lived only to be 81, he was also a chain smoker. Of course, and right now in China, the rate of smoking among men is about 52% of men smoke. Yet their life expectancy is about the same as that of the United States. So even though we have a 15% smoking rate and a much, much better medical system, the Chinese, with their very, very high smoking rate, seem to live as long as men in this country, almost as long, according to the statistics from the UN, etc. Well, right now, Massachusetts is on the verge of saying that only people who are 21 can buy tobacco. But unfortunately, attached to that terrible infantilizing law is a law that is saying that there will be no flavored tobacco sold in the state, or flavored vape products. So the vapors are asking people to email and contact their representatives, state representatives here, which I plan to do. And even though vapors really don't support smokers, I think we as smokers and as Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights should advocate for the freedom of vapors, of cigar smokers, of pipe smokers, and of all people who use tobacco. And indeed, we should advocate for the freedom of all Americans and people in the world. And that's what we should be doing, and that's what I am doing, and I hope more of you will join the cause.